History has a habit of following a period of extreme light with a period of deep shadow. In our last episode, we looked at Hisham I, the monk king of Córdoba. He was a man who ruled with a prayer bead in one hand and a loaf of bread for the poor in the other. He brought the law of Medina to the heart of Spain and built a society on the pillars of zuhd, asceticism and justice. He was the prophetic model in action. But there is a dangerous side effect to being a saint king. When a ruler is known for his mercy, the predators in the shadows begin to mistake that mercy for a green light. When Hisham died at the young age of 39, he left behind a kingdom that was wealthy and stable, but he also left behind a nobility that had grown restless. The wealthy families of Toledo and the powerful Visigothic converts, the Muwalladun, had spent 8 years watching a king who walked the streets in simple robes. They didn't see a holy man, they saw a soft administration. They looked at his young son Al-Hakam I, and they saw a boy they could bully. They believed that the Umayyad experiment was a fluke. They were about to find out that while Hisham was the soul of Al-Andalus, Al-Hakam was the iron ribcage that protected it. Part 2. The Iron Emir and the Problem of the Uncles Al-Hakam. I was a horse for a different course. From the very week he took the throne in 796 AD, the daggers were out. It wasn't just the nobles in distant cities, it was his own blood. His uncles, Suleiman and Abdallah, the brothers of the late Hisham, emerged from their exile in North Africa. They didn't come for a funeral, they came for the crown. Imagine the psychological pressure on a young man in his 20s. His father's legacy was one of peace, yet his first act as king had to be a civil war against his own family. Al-Hakam didn't hesitate. He realized early on that if he didn't hold the world in his palm with a grip of steel, the work of his grandfather, the Falcon, would be erased in a single summer. He defeated his uncles in a series of brutal skirmishes, forcing them back into the shadows. But this was only the beginning. The real threat wasn't on the battlefield. It was in the dining halls and secret meetings of the city of Toledo. Part 3. Toledo, the city of hidden kings. Toledo was the old Visigothic capital, and it hated being second to Córdoba. The elites there were a mix of old Arab tribal leaders and new converts who felt they weren't getting enough respect from the central government. They mocked Al-Hakam's youth. They insulted his tax collectors. In one famous incident, a mob in Toledo actually seized a government official and shaved his beard, the ultimate 8th century insult to his dignity. Al-Hakam sat in his palace in Córdoba and listened to the reports. He didn't send a scholar to negotiate, as his father might have. He didn't send a letter of warning. He realized that a warning to a rebel is just an invitation to rebel harder. He needed a solution that would end the rebellion not just for a year, but for a generation. He needed to strike at the head of the snake. This brings us to the most infamous night in the history of Islamic Spain. Part 4. The Invitation to the Kasbah. In 797 AD, the people of Toledo received surprising news. The young emir wasn't sending an army to burn their fields. Instead, he was sending a message of reconciliation. Al-Hakam announced that he was sending his young son, the crown prince, to Toledo to act as their governor. He claimed he wanted to bridge the gap between the capital and the provinces. To celebrate this new era of friendship, he invited the 700 leading nobles, scholars, and power brokers of Toledo to a grand banquet at the newly built palace, the Kasbah, within their city walls. The nobles were delighted. They saw this as a total surrender. They thought they had tamed the son of the monk king. They dressed in their finest silks, put on their ceremonial swords, and rode up to the palace gates. They expected music, roasted meats, and political concessions. They expected to be honored as the true kings of Toledo. Part 5. The Day of the Fosse. As the nobles arrived at the palace gates in small groups, the atmosphere was festive. But as they approached the entrance, the hospitality took a strange turn. They were asked to enter one by one. The emir's representative, a man named Amrus ibn Yusuf, greeted them with a forced smile. As each man passed through the heavy iron doors, he was led down a long, narrow, high-walled corridor toward the inner courtyard. But they never reached the table. They never tasted the food. In the courtyard of the palace, Al-Hakam's men had spent the previous 3 nights digging a massive, deep trench, the Fosse. Behind the inner doors, the emir's elite guards stood in absolute silence with their swords drawn. As each noble turned the corner, he was struck down before he could even scream. His body was rolled into the trench, one by one, 700 times. The story goes that a citizen outside the palace saw a strange steam or smoke rising from the high walls and asked a guard what was being cooked for such a massive feast. The guard looked at him with cold, dead eyes and replied, "They are not cooking meat. They are cooking a dish that will keep Toledo quiet for 100 years. By sunset, the trench was full. The Red Banquet had turned the elite of Toledo into a memory. The rebellion was not suppressed, it was deleted. How does a man stay in power after doing something so horrific? Al-Hakam knew that after the day of the Fosse, he could never trust his own people again. He did something that changed the structure of the Umayyad state forever. He created a personal guard of 5,000 soldiers known as the mutes, al-Kurs. They weren't literally unable to speak. They were called mutes because they were Slavic and African mercenaries who did not speak Arabic. Think about the psychological brilliance and the tragedy of this. Al-Hakam surrounded himself with men who couldn't be swayed by the silver tongues of the Arab nobles. They couldn't be bribed. They couldn't be reasoned with. They only understood the orders of the Emir. To the people of Córdoba, these guards were like robots, silent, terrifying, and utterly loyal. By creating the mutes, Al-Hakam was admitting that he had moved beyond dignity and into survival. He was the first emir to live in a gilded cage of his own making. If you think the day of the Fosse was the end of his troubles, you don't know the story of Córdoba. In 8018 AD, the tension in the capital finally snapped. The religious scholars, the same men who had loved his father Hisham, began to preach against Al-Hakam. They called him a tyrant, they hated his mutes, they hated his taxes. A massive riot broke out in the Arrabal, the southern suburb of Córdoba. Thousands of citizens armed themselves and marched on the palace. They wanted Al-Hakam's head. Al-Hakam didn't panic. While the mob was surrounding his palace, he sent his cavalry out through a secret gate to the rear of the city. He didn't just fight the rebels, he set fire to their homes behind them. When the rioters saw the smoke rising from their own houses, their morale shattered. Al-Hakam's response was characteristically iron. He executed the leaders, but then he did something even more impactful. He expelled 20,000 families from Córdoba. He forced them into exile. These refugees eventually traveled to North Africa and even as far as Alexandria and Crete, where they founded their own mini-kingdoms. Even in his mercy, Al-Hakam was terrifying. He didn't kill them all. He simply removed them from his sight forever. Part 8. The rebuttal to the Gascoigne lens. This brings us back to our philosophical fight. Critics like Bamba Gascoigne often look at Al-Hakam I and see a bloody tyrant. They compare him to his father and see a decline in morality. But I argue that Al-Hakam I was the necessary shadow of Hisham I. Without the day of the Fosse, Toledo would have fractured Al-Andalus into a dozen warring states. Without the mutes, the central government would have been a puppet of the wealthy families. Al-Hakam understood what we discussed regarding Cyrus the Great and Dhul Qarnayn. Power is a test. Sometimes the test isn't, can you be kind? Sometimes the test is, can you be strong enough to do the thing that makes everyone hate you, so that the nation can survive? He held the world in his palm, and yes, he squeezed. But he didn't squeeze for personal pleasure. He didn't spend his days in drunken debauchery. He was a tireless administrator. He spent his nights checking the city's defenses. He was a man who lived in a state of perpetual war so that his children wouldn't have to. In 822 AD, Al-Hakam I lay on his deathbed. He had survived rebellions, family betrayals, and the hatred of his own subjects. He had turned Córdoba from a city of scholars into a fortress of soldiers. When he looked at his son, Abd al-Rahman II, he saw a young man who was brilliant, artistic, and cultured. Because Al-Hakam had been the Iron Emir, his son didn't have to be. Because Al-Hakam had cleared the trench at Toledo, his son could build the libraries and the grand gardens that would make Córdoba the jewel of the world. Al-Hakam was the scaffolding of the Golden Age. Scaffolding is ugly, it's rough and it's made of iron, but without it, the beautiful cathedral can never be built. So we return to the question I asked at the beginning. Was Al-Hakam I a villain, or was he a necessary protector? If you go to Toledo today, the day of the Fosse is still a legend that haunts the stones. It serves as a reminder that the Umayyad peace wasn't just a gift from God. It was something fought for, with a terrifying level of resolve. Al-Hakam I proves that the dignity of the mat sometimes requires a wall of swords to protect it. He was the man who kept the lights of Al-Andalus from being snuffed out in the cradle. He was the son of a saint, the father of a genius, and the iron that held them both together. Can a leader truly be good if they have to do something evil to save their people? Or did Al-Hakam I betray the spirit of his father, the monk king? Let me know in the comments. I suspect this one will spark a debate.